I think you all have, you probably might have forgotten because last 2 weeks we did not have, last week we did not have Dhamma talk. We were discussing 37 factors of enlightenment, and we came to 4 foundations of mindfulness, and out of that we are in mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of Dhamma. In the Dhamma we are in mindfulness of the senses and sensory objects. 6 senses, 6 sense bases is translated. Pali word is ayatana, 6 sense bases. Eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body and mind. These are the 6 sense bases. These 6 sense bases have outward 6 bases. Form, feeling, form, sound, smell, taste, touch and mind, object, Dhamma. Now, the meditator, last time in my last talk I mentioned, knows the one, take one of the bases, one is eye. Meditator knows the eye, visual objects, and the fetter that arises depending on these 2. Meditator knows. Now, when we explain one, you can explain the other by the same way, the similar way. And last time I tried to explain how eye and visual objects, depending on them, fetter arises. I mentioned there are 10 fetters. They are belief in permanent self, doubt, believing in the attainment of liberation by following rituals and attached to it, greed, hatred, and desire for fine material existence, desire for immaterial existence, conceit, restlessness, and ignorance. These are the 10 fetters. Fetter means the binding factor. They bind us to samsara, existence. Now, they are all mental states, and these mental states bind us to another mental state that is called existence. Now let us see how this happened using only one. That is, I mentioned this briefly in my last talk. Let us go through this in some details, how it happens. Until this section is not very clear, one might wonder how, depending on senses and sensory objects, fetter arises. So, this is extremely important to understand. Buddha said, only those who know and see can overcome their influxes, asava, or fetters, hindrances, underlying tendencies, and all this one can overcome when one understands. What should one understand? One must understand the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body and mind. Or one must understand the form, feeling, perception, thought and consciousness. One must understand them. How can one understand them? What is that understanding? Not understanding any of these senses according to biological explanation. Biological explanation is very normal, physical, tangible study of physical, tangible things. But this, in the Buddha's teaching, understanding is, it is another parallel understanding, parallel to that physical understanding. Physical understanding also important, according to biology. By understanding eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body and mind, or body, feeling and so forth, according to biology, one cannot attain enlightenment. If so, all the doctors, all the physicians, all the nurses, and all the chemists and physicists should have been attained enlightened, should have been enlightened person. They are not. They still have greed, hatred, and illusion, and so forth. Then what is the kind of understanding a Buddha asks us to have to overcome these fetters? Understanding the true nature of them. What is the true nature of I? That is impermanent. I is impermanent. And visual objects are impermanent. When these two impermanent objects come together, another impermanent thing arises, that is called consciousness. Consciousness is one of the five aggregates. Eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, mind consciousness. They all arise and pass away. I consciousness doesn't stay all the time the same. I is not something fixed, permanent, eternal. It is changing. Constantly changing. That is why we have weak eyes, cataract eyes, and so forth, because it is changing all the time. You may explain this biologically, but we have to have insight and wisdom to understand it more deeply. Because this, not understanding this, can arouse our emotion. So we have to take care of our emotions. Biological understanding cannot take care of our emotions. But spiritual understanding can take care of our emotions. That means eyes are impermanent. Impermanent, impermanent, impermanent. Visual objects are impermanent. When these two impermanent objects meet, another impermanent thing arises, that's called consciousness. That also is impermanent. And then another impermanent thing arises called contact. Contact is impermanent. Then feeling arises, that's also impermanent. Impermanent feeling arises. That is that is one of the five aggregates. That is impermanent. Then perception, another aggregate, arises. That is also impermanent. then once we recognized, then desire can arise in our mind. That's impermanent. Now, this is a mental process. Desire is mental process. Now, why desire arises? In our previous way of thinking, ordinary person's way of thinking, the person thinks the object is beautiful. It is the person's way of thinking. It is nothing good and good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Objects are neither good nor bad, but thinking makes it good or bad. And then when we see the object according to our way of thinking, object is, if it is beautiful, desire, pleasure arises in us. Under this pleasure, underlying tendency, desire arises. In this pleasure, in this pleasurable thinking, pleasurable feeling, underlying tendency called desire arises. When this desire arises, we think the body, we think that there is self in 20 different ways. 20 ways. How? I take only one, and by that you can understand the rest. I consciousness, that means the thought or belief in permanent I arises in the mind. How does it arise? We think, this is a very subtle way. That is, form is identical with I. I, capital I, is identical with form. Or I and form are different. I and form are different. Or I is in the form. I means capital I, is in the form. Permanent entity is in the form. Or form is in I. Now remember these 4 steps. What are the 4? I, capital I, and the visual objects are identical, 1. Or I and visual objects are different. Then I is in the form, that is the 3rd step. 4th is or, form is in the I. So, similarly, we think this is one of the 5 aggregates. What is one of the 5 aggregates? Is form. Form. Now we still have feeling, perception, thought and consciousness. 4 more. Altogether 5. We call 5 aggregates. We multiply 5 by this 4. You get 20. 20 ways of thinking of permanent self. That's what I say, it's very subtle. 20 ways of thinking of permanent eternal self. That is one of the fetters. that fetter arises. This entire process, not ordinary people do know them. Ordinary people do not know them. Buddha said one who knows Dhamma knows this process. And therefore, the person knows this I, form, I consciousness, contact, feeling, perceptions, volition or thinking are all impermanent. When you see this, that everything is impermanent, then you come to a conclusion that is impermanent form, impermanent, within impermanent I, form, consciousness, contact, feeling, perception and volition, there is no permanent anything. When they all are impermanent, in this impermanent thing, impermanent mental phenomenon, there is nothing permanent. Nothing permanent. Buddha's one wonderful way of teaching is, he says in his teaching, if there is something permanent in us, that permanent thing should be able to control all other parts. Buddha gave a simile of a king. A king is, Buddha talked about, not modern democratic political system. Those days kings have all authority, all powers. All powers he has. Anything he can do to people. So when a king finds a person, for instance, a murderer, serial killer or just killing someone, then king can either put him to death or banish from his country or put him in jail or take all his possession, confiscate his possessions and so forth and so on. He can do anything to this person as a king. Why? Because he is the Lord. He is the head. He is the dictator. He has the power. So Buddha says similarly, if there is a permanent I, that permanent I should be able to tell the body, don't grow old. Don't be sick. Don't become weak. I punish you. But since there is nothing, we grow old. We become weak. And all the rest of the things happen to us. Why? There is no one permanent thing to control all these things. Having grey hair, losing hair, wrinkles, losing teeth, and so forth and so on. This is why Buddha said those who know the truth can overcome their fetters. Those who do not know this truth or don't pay attention to them, or they ignore them, and remain ignorant, they get carried away with everything. They don't get rid of them. In this section, I gave this in this detail for meditators to know how they can use their senses and sensory objects and stop fetters arising from them. Now the section says, the meditator dwells contemplating phenomena in phenomena in terms of the 6 internal and external sense bases. And how does he dwell contemplating phenomenon in phenomena in terms of the internal and external sense bases? This is how. So Buddha asked the question. And this is how she said. Here, a bhikkhu, I mentioned when Buddha used the word bhikkhu, this doesn't mean that only bhikkhus can do this. Bhikkhunis, upasikas and all these are included because this is a universal principle, universal teaching that anybody can practice. Moreover, whenever Buddha gave a sermon to a crowd, in the crowd there were monks, nuns, men and women. Those who sat in front of the Buddha, nearest to him, were bhikkhus. Therefore he addressed bhikkhus. Now, Buddha says here a bhikkhu understands the I, he understands the form, and he understands the fetter that arises dependent on both. So he understands the I, understands the form, and he understands a fetter arising depending on the I and form. Now, he sees the mechanism of arising fetter. He sees this. And then, when he sees that, he also understands how there comes to be the arisen of the unarisen fetter and how there comes to be the abandoning of the arisen fetter. First thing in his mind, when he sees an object, immediately fetter does not arise. But when the person looks at the object little longer, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, that part of course is a very psychological, even biological. The longer you pay attention to something, the stronger the impression will be in your mind. At first, if you look at the object and let it pass, the impression is very superficial, there is nothing special. So the Buddha said, he knows the I, he knows the object, and then as you keep paying attention to the object, unarisen fetter can arise. It was not there at the beginning. And then he understands the mechanism. Then this fetter is dangerous, harmful, impermanent, unsatisfactory, selfless. So this is the meditator's function, meditator's job. So meditator says eyes are impermanent, visual objects are impermanent, then eye consciousness, so forth and so on are impermanent, and also the fetter, that arisen, also impermanent. He knows the fetter, unarisen fetter is arisen, and then he begins to work on that. He says, this arisen fetter also is impermanent. Then he comes to understand, he also understands how there comes to be the arising of unarisen fetter, and how there comes to be the abandoning of the arisen fetter. Now, when you focus the mind on the fetter and see it impermanent, dangerous, unsatisfactory, without self, and then fetter doesn't have room in your mind to stay. Fetter slowly fades away, disappears. When the fetter disappears, you know that fetter disappears. And then, that means arisen fetter disappears. First it was not there, then you keep paying attention to the object a little longer, then gradually desire arises, fetter arises, and then you are a meditator, you focus the mind on it, on the whole mechanism, whole process. This is impermanent, this is impermanent, this is impermanent, this is impermanent, this is... So all you see is impermanence. And then fetter also slowly disappears. And then he knows, and how there comes to be the future non-arising of the abandoned fetter. Now it is gone from your mind. Now you know it is no longer there. It is not in my mind at all now. So you don't have to deal with that anymore. It's already gone. That also one must know. This is the beautiful way. Understanding, the one who understands is the one who can overcome influxes, fetters. Influxes means asava. One who understands can overcome anusaya, underlying tendencies. One who understands can overcome asava, influxes. One who understands can overcome fetters. One who has understanding can overcome hindrances. All the layers of defilements we can overcome only when we have understanding. And then this happened with constant practice, diligent practice, committed practice. We can see this happening. And this is how we can see the progress within ourselves. Most meditators have a question that they have been meditating, but they don't see any progress. Why don't they see progress? Because they don't understand this whole process, understand the way they do. They have all kind of other unnecessary things that they do in the name of meditation. And therefore, friends, I think my time is up for this morning. I want to continue this. It doesn't matter how long it takes. I want to finish this there are 6 paragraphs. I explain only one paragraph. There are 5 more paragraphs to explain in this section. When we explain all these 6 paragraphs in some details, then we will get the message. This first explanation may not be that clear, and it may not cut a groove in the mind. Only when we keep repeating this in other paragraphs, then it will cut a groove. And we may remember. The practice will become easy. With this, friends, I want to end this morning's talk. And also wishing all those who are suffering from various diseases taken care of by doctors, nurses and hospital staffs, may they recover soon, return to their normal health, continue their meditation, Dhamma practice and live long in good health, and finally attain liberation from samsaric suffering. And all these doctors and nurses and hospital staffs who are so compassionately taking care of their patients, may they risk their own lives, sacrifice their comforts, so may they continue their wonderful compassionate service and live long in very good health to help people, and they finally attain Nibbana. And those who financially support all these services in many places, may they continue their wonderful service for the benefit of humanity. Those who have lost their loved ones during COVID or other times and have been grieving, may they be free from grief and continue their wonderful practice and attain liberation from samsaric suffering. And those who are participating in this Dhamma talk, Dhamma discussion, meditation, and those who are not practicing, and those who are in a very, very bad situation economically, as their life is in threat. They are in such a dangerous zones, war zones, and poverty-stricken, sick, and so forth and so on. All those who are, without any exception, be free from those dire situations, return to normal life, regular life, and be able to practice Dhamma and liberate from samsaric suffering. With this thought, I like to end this morning session. Thank you.